My church applauded me for nearly 5 minutes on Sunday morning. They thanked me for 21 years of leading the Veterans Outreach Ministry, called me a faithful servant, and presented me with a framed certificate beneath the sanctuary cross. Less than 24 hours later, I stood outside the same office with my key card flashing red. I tried again, then again. The receptionist lowered her eyes before quietly saying, "Mr. Price, they told me not to let you in." I looked through the glass door. My nameplate was already gone. The folded church bulletin honoring me yesterday was still tucked inside my jacket pocket. If you've ever trusted a place enough to stop questioning the people inside it, stay with me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," the receptionist whispered. "So am I." She reached toward the desk phone. "I can call Pastor Hayes." "No." I smiled as gently as I could. "Please don't put yourself in the middle." She nodded with visible relief. Years of serving as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer had taught me something that saved more lives than panic ever could. When the situation suddenly changes, observe before reacting. I quietly stepped away from the entrance and sat on the bench outside the fellowship hall, where dozens of veterans had shared coffee after Sunday services for more than 2 decades. Yesterday, those same benches had been filled with applause. Today, they felt strangely unfamiliar. A few minutes later, Pastor Michael Hayes found me outside. "Daniel," he began softly, "I hoped we'd have this conversation privately." "I imagine so." He sat beside me. "The board met after yesterday's service." "That was quick." He looked uncomfortable. "There have been growing concerns." "About?" "You've seemed confused lately." Confused. The word hung between us. I wasn't aware. The board believes it's time to protect the ministry. Interesting choice. Not protect me. Protect the ministry. He handed me a thin folder. Inside rested a copy of the meeting minutes. My eyes immediately settled on one paragraph discussing continuity of mission leadership through administrative restructuring. I had written almost those exact words myself. 8 years earlier. Inside a Coast Guard community grant proposal that eventually funded our veterans' transitional housing program. Not similar. Identical. Pastor Hayes continued speaking, but I barely heard him. Somebody hadn't merely described the ministry. They had copied my own language. I closed the folder. "So, the decision is final?" He nodded sadly. "For now." "I understand." His shoulders relaxed. Exactly as though he expected an argument that never arrived. "I'll return my office keys. The electronic access has already been disabled." I noticed. He looked embarrassed. "I wasn't involved in that decision." "I believe you." And strangely enough, I did. Pastor Hayes had always cared more about people than paperwork. Administration belonged to someone else. Before leaving, I glanced once more toward the Veterans Outreach Office. The framed photograph of my old Coast Guard rescue crew had disappeared from the wall. That bothered me more than losing the office itself. Objects don't vanish accidentally during overnight leadership transitions. Driving home, I unfolded Sunday's church bulletin. The headline read, "Honoring Daniel Price for a Lifetime of Faithful Service." Tucked inside the bulletin was the folded copy of the board minutes. I compared them side by side. Then I saw it. One sentence inside the minutes repeated an unusual phrase I had invented years earlier while writing federal grant applications. Nobody outside our original grant team should have known it. Somebody hadn't simply removed me. They had built something new using work they claimed I was now too confused to remember. I drove home without calling anyone. Not the pastor, not the board, not even the veterans who depended on our ministry. During my years as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, I learned that the first report from the scene was rarely the complete story. When people panicked, they filled empty spaces with assumptions. My job had always been to separate observation from emotion. I intended to do the same now. The framed certificate from Sunday's service leaned against my kitchen wall exactly where I had set it the night before. 24 hours earlier, it had represented gratitude. Now it felt like evidence. I placed it beside the church bulletin and the copy of the board minutes. 3 documents. 1 celebration, 1 removal, 1 contradiction. The next morning, I unlocked the filing cabinet in my garage workshop, where I kept every grant proposal, annual report, donor letter, and housing agreement from the Veterans Ministry. People often joked that I never threw away paperwork. They were right. Search and rescue missions depended on records. So did ministries. Within 30 minutes, I found the original Coast Guard community grant proposal from 8 years earlier. I turned directly to page 17. There it was. Continuity of mission leadership through administrative restructuring. Word for word. Exactly as it appeared in the church board minutes. I hadn't borrowed the phrase from anyone. I had invented it while explaining how leadership transitions should protect veterans without interrupting housing services. Somebody had copied more than an idea. They had copied my work. That afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification showed Andrew Collins, the church executive director. "Daniel," he said warmly, "I hope you're settling into retirement." Retirement, interesting. Nobody had ever used that word with me. I wasn't aware I'd retired. A brief silence followed. The board felt this was the healthiest transition. "I see. We'd appreciate it if you didn't contact ministry donors for a while." "For how long?" "Until everything stabilizes." Technically reasonable. Emotionally revealing. "I understand." He sounded relieved. Exactly as though he had expected resistance. Instead, I quietly thanked him for calling. When the conversation ended, I wrote 1 sentence across the top of my notebook. Do not interrupt people who believe you've already surrendered. Late that afternoon, I visited the church parking lot, not to enter the building, but to collect several boxes of personal belongings the receptionist had quietly left beside the side entrance. Everything appeared ordinary. My old Coast Guard photographs, volunteer appreciation plaques, training manuals. Then I noticed 1 binder missing. The annual donor ledger. I searched every box again. Nothing. Rebecca Nolan found me kneeling beside my truck. She had spent 30 years auditing nonprofit organizations before retiring and volunteered with our Veterans Housing Committee every winter. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "I'm sorry." "So am I." She looked inside the boxes. They packed quickly. They missed a few things. They also took one. I explained about the missing donor ledger. Rebecca became unusually quiet. "That isn't just a bookkeeping notebook." "I know. It contains donor restrictions." "Exactly. Some gifts supported food programs. Others paid utility bills. Several specifically funded transitional housing. Without that ledger, no one could easily verify whether future donations followed the original agreements. Rebecca looked directly at me. Daniel, yesterday's board meeting wasn't the beginning. What makes you say that? She reached into her purse and removed a folded property document she had reviewed only a week earlier. Across the top appeared a name I had never seen before. Harbor Light Veterans Initiative. It wasn't our ministry. Yet one church housing lease now carried that organization's name. The first thing I did after Rebecca showed me the unfamiliar lease wasn't call the pastor or Andrew Collins. Instead, I folded the document, slipped it inside my notebook, and thanked her for trusting me. Coast Guard rescue operations taught me that once people realized you understood the situation, they often stopped making mistakes. Until then, they usually made several. I wasn't ready for them to stop. Rebecca watched me close the notebook. You're calmer than I expected. I've spent enough nights in rough water to know panic never improves visibility. She smiled. That sounds like something you've said before. Probably because it's true. On my way home, I passed the transitional housing duplexes our church had operated for nearly a decade. 6 veterans lived there while rebuilding their lives after homelessness, addiction recovery, or difficult medical treatment. They weren't statistics. I knew every one of them. Frank still planted tomatoes behind Unit 3 every spring. Luis volunteered at the food pantry twice a week. Walter had finally found steady work after sleeping in his truck for almost a year. Looking at those homes, I suddenly understood why the lease mattered more than my office. The ministry wasn't the prize. The housing was. That evening, Andrew Collins called again. I wanted to make sure you received your personal belongings. I did. Good. We're trying to make this transition as respectful as possible. I appreciate that. He hesitated. The congregation will probably ask questions. I'm sure they will. We're telling everyone you've decided to enjoy retirement. Technically true. Emotionally dishonest. I won't contradict you. His voice immediately relaxed. Thank you, Daniel. After ending the call, I wrote another sentence inside my notebook. People often reveal their real deadline when they think resistance has ended. The following morning, Rebecca met me at a small coffee shop across from the county administration building. Without saying a word, she slid a printed document across the table. I checked the nonprofit registry. Across the first page appeared the name again. Harbor Light Veterans Initiative. Incorporation date. 3 months earlier. 3 months before Sunday's recognition service. 3 months before my key card stopped working. I looked up slowly. They planned this long before the board meeting. Rebecca nodded. There's more. She pointed toward the listed incorporator. Andrew Collins. No surprise there. Then she tapped another name. Pastor Michael Hayes. I frowned. I don't think Michael understands what this means. Neither do I. But legally, he's part of it. That hurt more than I expected. Not because it proved guilt, because it suggested trust had been used as paperwork. Rebecca continued reading. The stated mission sounds familiar. I looked closer. Nearly every paragraph echoed the language from my original Coast Guard grant proposal. Not copied exactly, just carefully rewritten, enough to avoid obvious comparison, not enough to hide its origin. I leaned back quietly. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Rebecca asked, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing." She looked surprised. "For now. I'm going to let them believe I accepted retirement." "Why?" "Because if Harbor Light is already operating, they'll keep moving assets." I nodded. "And every transfer creates another record." Rebecca smiled for the first time since this began. "I was hoping you'd say that." Before we left, she handed me one final envelope. Inside rested grant correspondence she had reviewed during last year's audit. One page carried a handwritten note. Housing lease amendments must be completed before the Community Foundation renewal deadline. The deadline sat only 12 days away. For the first time, I realized this wasn't merely about replacing me. Someone was racing the calendar. The 12-day deadline changed everything. Until Rebecca showed me the Community Foundation correspondence, I believed someone wanted my position. Now I understood they wanted something much larger. They wanted time. During nearly 3 decades as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, I learned that emergencies always had clocks attached to them. Sometimes the clock measured oxygen, sometimes incoming weather, sometimes the tide. This one measured paperwork. 12 days. If nobody questioned the lease amendments before then, the annual grant renewal would move forward under whatever organizational structure appeared in the official records. Not next year. Not someday. Now. Rebecca closed the grant folder. "What are you thinking?" "That we stopped asking the right question." She waited. "I kept asking why they removed me. And I should have been asking what needed to happen after I was gone." That single realization reorganized every piece of evidence. The copied grant language, the missing donor ledger, the newly registered nonprofit, the overnight lockout. None of them centered on me. I had simply been standing between the housing program and an approaching administrative deadline. The next morning, I drove past the church, but didn't stop. Instead, I visited the duplexes again. Frank was repairing a broken porch railing. Luis was loading donated groceries into his truck. Walter waved from across the parking lot. Nothing had changed for them yet. Looking at those homes, I remembered writing the original grant proposal years earlier. One sentence returned almost word for word. "Stable housing creates stable recovery." That sentence had never been about buildings. It had always been about people. As I prepared to leave, Walter jogged across the lawn. "Mr. Price?" "Morning. We heard you retired." "So I've been told." He laughed politely. "You coming back next week?" "I hope so." He smiled. "So do we." Simple words. Heavy responsibility. Back home, I spread every document across my dining room table. Board minutes, church bulletin, grant proposal, nonprofit registration, community foundation correspondence, housing lease. The timeline finally became obvious. 3 months before my removal, Harbor Light Veterans Initiative was incorporated. 2 months later, revised lease drafts appeared. Several weeks after that, donor communications quietly changed. Then Sunday's public recognition, Monday's lockout. Everything followed a carefully staged administrative sequence. Late that afternoon, Rebecca called. "I found the county property records, and The duplexes aren't owned by the church. I sat upright. What? The church leases them. From whom? A local family trust. That surprised me. For 21 years, I had assumed the church owned the buildings outright. Rebecca continued. The current lease expires in 11 days. One day before the community foundation deadline. The timing couldn't be accidental. If the renewal is signed under Harbor Light, Rebecca finished the thought, future grant payments would naturally follow the organization managing the lease. Not because anyone stole the money, because the paperwork redirected responsibility. The mechanism suddenly became painfully simple. Andrew didn't need to empty bank accounts. He only needed to become the recognized administrator before renewal. The documents would do the rest. That evening, Pastor Hayes knocked unexpectedly on my front door. He wasn't carrying church papers, only a casserole prepared by several members of the congregation. I wanted to see how you were doing. I'm all right. We sat on the porch until sunset. Finally, he spoke. Andrew tells me the transition is going smoothly. I looked toward the quiet street. I'm sure that's what he believes. Pastor Hayes nodded slowly. For the first time since this began, I noticed genuine uncertainty in his eyes. He trusted Andrew. But trust had begun asking him questions paperwork could no longer ignore. Pastor Hayes left my porch just as the evening church bells echoed across town. I watched his truck disappear around the corner before carrying every document back inside. For the first time since Monday morning, I believed he truly didn't understand what was unfolding around him. That realization brought no comfort. It only meant someone else's confidence had quietly become his blind spot. During my Coast Guard years, rescue crews often discovered that the greatest danger wasn't the storm everyone could see. It was the current moving beneath the surface. Andrew Collins had become that current. He wasn't asking anyone to steal. He wasn't asking anyone to lie outright. He was simply moving paperwork one document at a time until the destination changed without most people noticing. The next morning, Rebecca arrived carrying a thick accordion folder. I visited the community foundation, and they answered a question we never thought to ask. She spread several grant agreements across my dining room table. Each annual housing grant listed one requirement in bold print. The administering organization must also be the active leaseholder throughout the funding period. I looked toward the lease renewal date again. 11 days. Then back to Harbor Light's incorporation date. 3 months earlier. Everything aligned. Rebecca tapped another paragraph. If the lease changes before renewal, the grant administrator changes naturally. She nodded. No emergency board vote. No donor approval. No dramatic announcement. The paperwork simply follows the lease. I finally understood why Andrew wanted me quietly retired instead of publicly removed. Conflict invited scrutiny. Retirement invited sympathy. One created investigations. The other encouraged everyone to move on. That afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk located the current housing lease within minutes. I compared it carefully against the copy Rebecca had found. Only one page differed. An unsigned amendment rested behind the original agreement. Future Administrator, Harbor Light Veterans Initiative. Signature lines remained blank. The transfer hadn't happened. Not yet. The opportunity still existed to prevent it. Outside the courthouse, I received another call from Andrew. Daniel, good afternoon. I wanted you to know we'll be introducing the congregation to Harbor Light next Sunday. Interesting. Not after the grant renewal. Before it. As a partner organization? Exactly. People respond better to gradual transitions. He sounded pleased with himself. Almost relieved. I thanked him for letting me know. When the call ended, I wrote another sentence inside my notebook. People reveal tomorrow's paperwork when they believe today's paperwork is safe. That evening, I visited the duplexes one final time before sunset. Frank invited me onto his porch. You've been checking on us a lot lately. I have. You worried? I looked across the small courtyard where Luis was helping Walter repair a bicycle donated to one of the veterans' children. I'm making sure everyone keeps their home. Frank smiled. We already have one. His answer caught me unexpectedly. To him, home wasn't paperwork. It was people. I silently promised myself those people would never become collateral damage inside an administrative transition they knew nothing about. Late that night, Rebecca called again. I found the original donor restrictions. I thought the ledger disappeared. It did. But one donor mailed duplicate copies to the Community Foundation years ago. She paused. Daniel, what? Every major housing donor required written approval before changing the administering organization. I closed my eyes. Andrew didn't know those duplicate records existed. The transfer wasn't merely incomplete. It couldn't legally happen the way he expected. For the first time since my church key stopped working, I realized I wasn't trying to win my position back. I was trying to protect a promise made to every veteran who believed the church's word was stronger than its paperwork. 5 days remained before the Community Foundation renewal deadline. I placed every document inside a weathered Coast Guard incident binder that had traveled with me through hurricanes, flood rescues, and aircraft evacuations. During my rescue years, every operation ended with one final package of documentation. Not because paperwork mattered more than people, because paperwork protected people after memories began to disagree. This investigation had finally reached that stage. Rebecca arrived just after sunrise carrying 2 additional folders. I think we have everything. I hope not. She looked surprised. You hope not? If Andrew believes I'm finished, he'll keep moving. And every new document becomes another witness. She smiled. You really were a rescue swimmer. We learned to let the current reveal where it was going. That morning, the church newsletter appeared online. Near the bottom sat a short announcement. Next Sunday, introducing Harbor Light Veterans Initiative, expanding our ministry's future outreach. No mention of replacing anyone. No mention of the housing program. Only hopeful language. Exactly the kind of announcement that encouraged applause instead of questions. I quietly printed a copy. Another timestamp. Another piece of chronology. Around noon, Pastor Hayes called. Daniel, you sound tired. I am. He hesitated. I've been reviewing board documents. What prompted that? Our conversation. Silence followed. Finally, he asked, when did you first write the phrase, continuity of mission leadership? 8 years ago. You're certain? I still have the original grant proposal. He sighed. I found the same wording in several newer planning documents. I expected you might. Another long silence. Then he spoke almost to himself. I should have read more carefully. That sentence mattered more than any apology, because it meant he had finally begun reading instead of trusting. Late that afternoon, Rebecca and I met with an attorney who specialized in nonprofit governance. We weren't preparing a lawsuit, we were verifying our evidence. He spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every document without interruption. Finally, he closed the binder. This is unusual. In what way? The strongest evidence isn't the financial paperwork. What is? He placed 3 documents side by side. My original Coast Guard grant proposal, the church board minutes, Harbor Light's organizational mission statement. The language creates one continuous documentary trail. He pointed carefully. Original authorship. Copied governance language. Derivative organizational purpose. None of those documents proved criminal intent. They proved something quieter. Origin. The new organization hadn't developed independently. It had grown directly from work I created for the church ministry years earlier. The attorney continued. Now compare that with the donor restrictions. Rebecca handed him the duplicate copies from the Community Foundation. He smiled gently. That's the turning point. Why? Because even if Harbor Light existed legally, it still couldn't inherit restricted donor obligations automatically. Exactly. The documents no longer supported the administrative transition. They stopped it. As we gathered our papers, the attorney offered one final piece of advice. Present everything privately first. Why? Because if your goal is protecting veterans, he looked directly at me, the fastest solution is the one requiring the fewest wounded relationships. Driving home, I realized that was exactly what Margaret, my late wife, would have advised if she had still been alive. Not victory. Stewardship. That evening, Andrew sent a brief email to every ministry volunteer. He thanked them for supporting a smooth leadership transition and invited them to Sunday's Harbor Light presentation. Attached to the email was a draft organizational chart. Across the top appeared a familiar title. Executive Director, Andrew Collins. For the first time since Monday morning, Andrew stopped hiding the destination. He believed the journey was already over. He had no idea tomorrow morning every document he trusted would be sitting inside one binder on Pastor Hayes' desk. Pastor Hayes called before 8 o'clock the next morning. His voice sounded older than it had only 24 hours earlier. Daniel, he said quietly, would you come to the church before anyone else arrives? I'll be there. I carried the Coast Guard incident binder beneath one arm, exactly as I had carried rescue reports after every completed operation. Inside rested no accusations. Only chronology. Only documentation. Only the truth arranged in the order it had happened. When I entered the conference room, Pastor Hayes sat alone at the long oak table. The Harbor Light organizational chart lay beside him. My original grant proposal rested underneath it. He looked at both documents for several seconds before speaking. I compared every sentence. So did I. You were right. I shook my head gently. No. The documents are right. He nodded slowly. I trusted Andrew. I know. I never imagined. His voice faded. Trust had not made him dishonest. It had simply made him stop verifying. Rebecca arrived moments later carrying duplicate donor restrictions from the Community Foundation. Without a word, she placed them beside the lease amendment, nonprofit registration, board minutes, church bulletin, and Harbor Light mission statement. The binder had become a complete timeline. No speculation, no missing links. Only one continuous administrative sequence. A few minutes later, Andrew Collins entered the room carrying a laptop and several presentation folders for Sunday's announcement. He smiled politely when he saw me. "I didn't expect you." "I imagine not." Pastor Hayes looked toward him. "Please sit down." Andrew glanced at the documents spread across the table. His confidence barely changed. "I'm assuming this is about Daniel's concerns." Pastor Hayes slid my original Coast Guard grant proposal toward him. "Read the highlighted paragraph." Andrew did. Then the Harbor Light mission statement. Then the board minutes. His smile disappeared. Pastor Hayes continued. "Now compare the nonprofit registration." Andrew remained silent. Rebecca quietly added the lease amendment, then the donor restrictions. Finally, the Community Foundation correspondence. No one raised a voice. No one accused him of stealing. The documents simply continued speaking. For nearly a minute, the room remained completely silent. Then Andrew finally looked up. "I was trying to expand the ministry." Pastor Hayes answered calmly. "Then why wasn't the board told Harbor Light already existed?" No reply. Rebecca spoke next. "Why were donor restrictions never disclosed during planning?" Still nothing. I asked only one question. "When did you first decide I needed to disappear?" Andrew lowered his eyes. "You would have opposed the transition. I would have opposed hiding it." That difference settled heavily across the room. Pastor Hayes folded his hands. "Andrew, were you ever planning to ask donors for written approval?" A long silence followed. Finally, Andrew whispered, "No." The answer ended the investigation. Not because it proved every possible motive, because it answered the only question that mattered. The people responsible for protecting donor intent already knew enough to stop the transfer. Pastor Hayes stood slowly. "I'm suspending Sunday's Harbor Light presentation." Andrew closed his laptop without argument. "The lease amendments?" Rebecca asked. "Withdrawn." "The nonprofit?" "It can exist." Pastor Hayes looked directly at Andrew. "But it will not receive ministry responsibilities or donor-restricted assets." Andrew nodded once. Years of carefully prepared paperwork had collapsed beneath one sentence. Not because someone shouted louder. Because documentation reached the right people before the deadline. As everyone gathered their papers, Pastor Hayes stopped me near the doorway. "I owe you more than an apology. You owe the veterans stability." He smiled sadly. "You really are a rescue swimmer." I looked back toward the conference table where the binder remained open. No. Today I was simply protecting people who couldn't see the current beneath the water. Outside, the morning sun was rising above the church sanctuary. The housing program had been preserved. The grant renewal would continue under its original stewardship. Yet as I stood quietly beside the front steps where the congregation would soon arrive, I realized restoring paperwork would be much easier than restoring trust inside a church family that had nearly lost sight of why the ministry existed in the first place. 3 months later, I unlocked the Veterans Outreach Office with the very same key card that had flashed red on that Monday morning. This time the light turned green. Not because I had won an argument, because the church had chosen stewardship over convenience. Pastor Hayes insisted the congregation hear the full administrative story, not through rumors or accusations, but through documented facts. During a special members' meeting, he explained that the Harbor Light transition had been suspended, the lease amendments withdrawn, and every donor-restricted agreement independently reviewed before any future organizational changes would be considered. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Some truths deserve reflection before celebration. Andrew Collins resigned from his administrative position several weeks later. He submitted a written statement acknowledging that he had pursued structural changes without fully honoring donor restrictions or transparent governance. The church accepted his resignation, commissioned an independent nonprofit compliance review, and adopted new policies requiring multiple levels of oversight before ministry assets, grants, or housing agreements could ever be transferred again. The veterans never lost their homes. Frank still grew tomatoes behind Unit 3. Luis continued serving at the food pantry every Wednesday. Walter became the first resident to purchase his own small home after completing the transitional housing program. Watching him carry boxes into his new place reminded me why every difficult conversation had been worthwhile. One afternoon, Pastor Hayes joined me outside the duplexes. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to believe protecting the church meant avoiding conflict. And now, I think protecting the church means protecting the people God entrusted to it." I smiled. That's the ministry we were trying to build all along. A few weeks later, the church removed my framed retirement certificate from the hallway. Not because they wanted to forget it, because they replaced it with something better. Beside photographs of volunteers serving meals, repairing homes, mentoring veterans, and praying together, they mounted a simple wooden plaque made from reclaimed oak. I built it in my workshop. The inscription read, "Faith is measured not by the titles we hold, but by the people we faithfully protect when no one is watching." There was no mention of my name, no reference to Andrew, no reminder of the investigation. Only the lesson. That was enough. On Sunday morning, after the service ended, I walked through the fellowship hall where veterans once again gathered around coffee, laughter, and old stories. The benches outside the sanctuary looked exactly as they had before everything changed. Only I had changed. Years ago, the Coast Guard taught me that rescue doesn't always happen in open water. Sometimes it happens inside meeting rooms, filing cabinets, lease agreements, and quiet conversations where integrity is tested one decision at a time. If this story reminded you that institutions are strongest when they protect people instead of appearances, carry that lesson with you. Ask careful questions. Honor faithful stewardship. And remember that documentation is never the enemy of trust. When used with honesty, it becomes one of trust's greatest protectors. God bless every veteran, every volunteer, every faithful servant, and every community courageous enough to choose truth before convenience.